In our last passage, Habakkuk began by expressing a complaint to God that God wasn't listening or responding to the trouble in Israel that Habakkuk saw. And God answered Habakkuk by saying that he was raising up the Chaldeans, that is, the Babylonians, to bring judgment and justice upon Israel. And we heard the brutal way in which the Chaldeans were described as an awful, evil nation. And it was a surprising answer from God to a genuine question. And now Habakkuk responds to God's answer with what is partly a complaint and partly a lament about what is to come. Habakkuk begins by addressing God in verse 12, and twice Habakkuk uses God's personal name. When you see here the word Lord in all capital letters, it's the way the English translators have translated the name Yahweh, which is the name that God told Moses back in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. And so when Moses was sent to lead Israel out of Egypt, Moses asked God, "Who shall I say has sent me?" And God says that his name is Yahweh, which means I am who I am. And this personal name for God, Yahweh, is used all throughout the Old Testament, especially to refer to God making personal promises to his people. It's a very relational name. And that is why Habakkuk sounds so confident here when he says, "We shall not die." Despite the terrible news that the Chaldeans are about to invade Israel as the tool of God's judgment and reproof or punishment, Habakkuk knows that they cannot be wiped out entirely as a nation, or God will have failed to keep his promises. And Habakkuk knows that God values consistency in his character. He says, "You who are of purer eyes than to see evil and cannot look at wrong." And that is why Habakkuk now goes back to ask a similar question to the one in his first complaint, but now he has the additional information of knowing God's first answer. Now, notice how similar this is to verse 3 of chapter 1. It says, "Why do you look idly at traitors and remain silent when the wicked swallows up the man more righteous than he?" But because God's first response, it now seems that Habakkuk has quickly changed his view about who the wicked are. Back in verse 4, it was a comment on the corruption that existed within Israel. They were the wicked ones. But now that God says he's sending the evil Chaldeans to punish Israel, Habakkuk is concerned more about the wicked Chaldeans swallowing up the more righteous Israel. In verses 14 to 17, Habakkuk then uses the illustration of a fisherman and fish in the sea to make his point about how absurd God's plan is. In verse 14, Habakkuk describes people as helpless as fish in the sea. They are vulnerable and without leadership or direction. They are moved by the currents around them. And in verse 15, he then speaks of a fisherman who sits above these fish. This translation uses the word he for the fisherman. And if you've got another translation, it might instead say the wicked foe, which just makes it clearer that the fisherman in this illustration is the same wicked who swallow up the righteous in verse 13. The fisherman represents the wicked Chaldeans. And as you see the way that Habakkuk describes the fisherman, it is similarly brutal to the way that God described the Chaldeans in his first response. Now we see they are dragged and gathered with a hook. He enjoys luxury and riches at the expense of the fish. And as a result, this fisherman worships his nets by sacrificing to them and making offerings. Now, all this is highlighting that the Chaldeans, the wicked enemy of Israel, are a brutal and barbaric and idolatrous nation. And in verse 17, Habakkuk makes the point of this illustration by asking the same kind of question he asked in verse 13. Notice that these two lines are in parallel, repeating the same idea. In the first line, he uses the fishing analogy, and in the second line, he stops the metaphor and speaks very literally. Will the fisherman be allowed to keep on doing this forever, thriving at the expense of the fish? Will the Chaldeans be allowed to keep on mercilessly killing their enemies forever, even at the expense of God's own people? Now, because Habakkuk knows that God will keep his promises and is confident that Israel will not die, Habakkuk wonders when this will end. Because surely God can't let the Chaldeans go unpunished for their own evil and wickedness. And so again, Habakkuk waits for another answer. And with his typical confidence that borders on arrogance, Habakkuk says in chapter 2, verse 1, I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint. It is as if to say, God, this cannot be the answer. It does not make sense. So I'm going to wait until you explain yourself. In verses 2 to 5, God again answers Habakkuk. And you will notice that he starts in a very similar way to his first response in chapter 1, verse 5. He wants Habakkuk and the people more broadly to hear this message. He says, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, that is a writing tablet, so he may run who reads it, which means that a herald, a news carrier, can go and spread this news that God is about to share. Now, this all sounds very similar to the commands to look and see and wonder and be astounded in God's first response in chapter 1, verse 5. Now, the idea is that God is providing Habakkuk a warning about the future, and this warning needs to be shared and spread with as many as possible. And so in verse 3, God says, For still the vision awaits its appointed time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. Again, this reflects back to chapter 1, verse 1, where we were told that this book contains the oracle, the message that Habakkuk saw. It is a vision of the future. And now God says that this vision will soon become reality. Now, the phrase, it will not lie, reflects back to Habakkuk's own confidence in God in chapter 1, verse 12, where he's confident God will keep his promises. And God is affirming for Habakkuk that God will indeed remember his covenant promises with his people. His words are true, they do not lie. And that is actually both a comfort and a curse. The comfort is that it means that Israel will not die out completely, as Habakkuk was very confident of. But the curse is that some very harsh judgment will fall upon them. Ironically, just as Habakkuk said in verse 1 that he's going to stand here and wait for God's response like a watchman in a watchtower, well, God says, wait for it. Stand there. It surely will come. It will not delay. Which is to say that it will happen at exactly the right time, exactly when God has planned for it. And in this grand scheme of things, it will come rather quickly. If you remember that King Josiah died in 609 BC, and then he was a good king of Israel. And after his death, Israel turns away from following God. And we know in history that Babylon, that is the Chaldeans, first invade Jerusalem in 597 BC. And so Habakkuk is living and writing somewhere in the middle of this gap. And it's probably at most only a few years before God acts and brings about this monumental event in Israel's history. Now, verses 2 and 3 form an introduction of sorts to the rest of this chapter. It's a call to see what God is about to do and to be ready for it. And then from verse 4, God details a vision for the future. And if you were to sum up God's whole answer here in a single sentence, it would be this one in verse 4. Behold is another way of saying, look and see what happens. And then in this verse, two groups of people are contrasted. Translating this from the original Hebrew language it was written in to English might make it a little less clear for us. But simply, you have, firstly, those whose soul is puffed up. That is, those who are proud or arrogant. And then you have those who are righteous. Two opposing groups. And the proud are described as having a soul that is not upright. And this is a way of saying that they will therefore be condemned. They puff themselves up, but they will ultimately face judgment because they are not upright. So it becomes clear that this is a statement of God about the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, the ruthless enemy of Israel that God was raising up to bring judgment on Israel. Well, those evil Chaldeans who are a law unto themselves, as Habakkuk already complained. Well, this tiny little summary here reminds Habakkuk that they, the Chaldeans, will not be spared of judgment for their evil. And what is this tiny little piece of comfort in verse 4 here is going to be expanded on in great detail from verse 6 until the end of this chapter. And so if the proud and arrogant are going to fall in judgment because of their unrighteousness, then what about the righteous? Well, the righteous shall live by his faith. This is perhaps the most well-known phrase in all of Habakkuk. It is quoted in the New Testament in Romans 1:17, in Galatians 3:11, and in Hebrews 10:38. One commentator suggests that the entire book of Romans is based on unpacking this single phrase, and I think that's a reasonable assessment of the book of Romans. The contrast in this verse is this: if the proud will fall, then the righteous will live. Now, in the context of Israel, the language of righteous is not about being good. It is more of a legal, religious term. It's a way of referring to the concept of Israel being in a covenant relationship with God, which goes all the way back to Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6, when this covenant begins. If the proud and arrogant look in their soul and are not upright, the righteous are those who look outside of themselves for their legal standing by their faith in God's character and promises. And what makes you righteous is that you have received God's grace and mercy, expressed in trust that he will keep his promises. These righteous shall live, which carries, there's a couple of layers of meaning here. Firstly, they live is a reference to the fact that they will survive the coming judgment. It is what Habakkuk expressed so confidently in chapter 1, verse 12, when he said, "We shall not die." Now, even when judgment comes in the form of the Chaldeans on Israel, the covenant people of God will survive. They won't all be wiped out. And later on in biblical history, this group is referred to in many ways, such as the faithful remnant in Isaiah chapter 10 and Romans 11, or the branch of Jesse in Isaiah chapter 11. Secondly, as Paul will expand upon in the book of Romans, the righteous shall live by his faith, which is a way of describing the life and character of God's covenant people. Not only do they survive judgment, but their life is marked by certain habits, practices, morality, and character, their way of life. They are not proud and arrogant. They reflect the character and desires of God in their own patterns of living day by day, in faith and trust that God's way is the best way to live, and that he keeps his promises. And so this second phrase in verse 4 is not only a statement of God's grace, but it also becomes an invitation to be this kind of person, to live this kind of way, to have this kind of trust that God is good and he does keep his promises. And to do this, even in the face of the Chaldean armies who will come and destroy so much around them. There is a subtle invitation to either be proud and puffed up within ourselves and therefore face judgment, or to humbly seek God and his way of life. Now, after this summary of the future in verse 4, we go to a further description of the plight of the proud and arrogant, specifically the Chaldeans. Here in verse 5, we get a reference to wine being a traitor, which is a bit of a visual picture for us. Wine might deceive us in offering happiness, but it's a traitor. It never truly satisfies, and ultimately it will bring our downfall in a drunken kind of descent. And this is true of wine or of wealth or power, or all the things that the Chaldeans were pursuing. And when we pursue these things, it creates an unrest in us. It is never enough. And we get a few more descriptions here about the greed and the devastation of the Chaldeans, reminding us again of how they were so negatively described back in the end of chapter 1. And so what will become of these awful, evil people, these Chaldeans? And Habakkuk so desperately wants to know, how will these proud and puffed up, evil Chaldeans find their own judgment? And God will go into great detail in continuing to answer that for Habakkuk and for us in our next passage.